Everyone, my name is Ross Wallace. I am a principal at Santis Health and an advisor to the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. And it's my great pleasure to be welcoming so many of you to what I know will be a fascinating and important and timely conversation about the power of precision medicine. I'll be offering some very brief introductory remarks and helping manage the Q&A at the end of this session. But for now, we'll just give the folks signing in another minute or two to reach a critical mass, and then we'll jump in. Thanks so much for being with us today. Okay, folks, let's get started. I know that people will be dripping in and out as this event goes on, and certainly in some parts of this fine and large country, it's lunchtime. So we know that people are doing some multitasking as they go, and we want to respect your time and your willingness to spend a chunk of it with us today. So let's jump in without further ado. So I'm going to start by offering a land acknowledgement, which is obviously an incredibly important part of where we find ourselves as a country and as a community. I'd like to begin by acknowledging the Indigenous peoples of all the lands that we are on today. While we meet today on a virtual platform, I would like to take a moment to acknowledge the importance of the land which we each call home. As I reside in Toronto, I acknowledge that the land I am on is the traditional territory of many nations, including the Mississaugas of the Credit, the Anishinaabe, the Chippewa, the Haudenosaunee, and the Wendat peoples, and is now home to many diverse First Nations, Inuit, and Métis peoples. We also acknowledge that Toronto is covered by Treaty 13 and the Mississaugas of the Credit. As many of you come from all across Canada, we acknowledge and reiterate the ancestral and unceded territory of all the Inuit, Métis, and First Nations people that call this nation home from coast to coast to coast. We do this to reaffirm our commitment and responsibility to improving relationships between nations and to improving our own understanding of local Indigenous peoples and their cultures. Okay, with that, let me just take a moment to share a little bit of context about how we find ourselves here today and about the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. So spurred by important advances in biomedical research that all of you know lots about, Canadian healthcare systems are on the cusp of a new era of precision medicine. But capturing the promise of that new era will only be possible if a wide range of partners, from policymakers and patient groups to clinicians and innovators, can come together to accomplish a number of goals: improving the reimbursement of genetic tests, optimizing the use of RWE to reduce payer and policymaker uncertainty, and accelerating the development and the delivery of managed entry agreements. So these are all interconnected goals and objectives and all part of capturing the promise of this new world that we're right on the cusp of and already, frankly, beginning to see the biggest opportunities from. That's really the overarching subject that we're going to spend the next 85 minutes or so talking about today. And it's my great pleasure to be here representing an organization called the Resilient Healthcare Coalition. For those who are not familiar with RHC, our goal is to create more resilient healthcare systems in Canada that can deliver better care earlier, more efficiently, and more effectively, supported by and supporting a world-class life sciences ecosystem. For us and the 13 organizations that you see here that represent our steering committee, it really means two overarching goals. The first is accelerating the adoption of innovative health technologies, and the second is leveraging healthcare data to better support system resilience and patient care and to ensure that we have all of the inputs and all of the insights required to reduce uncertainty, to share risk, and to ultimately lead to a situation where we see faster, better, and more comprehensive access to diagnostics, to therapeutics, to vaccines, and to medical devices. So that's RHC, and it's a pleasure to be here on their behalf today. And now I think it's my great opportunity to pass the microphone to Louise Binder, who for many on this call needs no introduction whatsoever, but I will just situate her in this conversation as, among many other things, a health policy consultant with Save Your Skin Foundation and really a driving force behind this question of precision medicine, its potential, and its opportunity. Louise, why don't I pass the mic to you to talk a little bit about why we're here today, the organization that you're here on behalf of, and the business case that anchors so much of the conversation we're about to have.
Thank you, Ross, and thank you to all of you who've taken time to join us today, as well as my fellow panelists. CONECTed is a network that started about 7 years ago, and it's a network of national patient organizations that started to recognize that precision medicine was becoming important in the landscape of oncology research and treatments. And so we came together, a number of us, with the mandate to ensure that there was an environment in Canada for cancer patients to have access to cancer therapies, including the precision medicine. So our patient groups came together to promote greater education, understanding of therapies, to ensure that Canadians have equal, timely access to these therapies, companion diagnostics, and supportive care. And our first step was to create a foundational document, sort of setting out the landscape, both historically and where we are now. And that document is what we call our business case for precision medicine, which we titled Getting Better Faster, the case for optimizing access to precision medicine in the wake of the revolution in cancer care. You going to do a little housekeeping for us, Ross?
Ross, you're muted.
Thank you. For those who have not had a chance to read that business case, it is an incredibly robust and impressive piece of work. So thank you, Louise, for teasing the introduction. I know many elements and cornerstones of that report will be spoken to and addressed over the course of this conversation. So you've done a lovely job of teeing us up. Just a very quick housekeeping note before I offer introductions to the remaining panelists. We are using the sort of formal webinar format for Zoom. And so that's why you can see us, but we can't see you. And so just because of the large number of people who've RSVP'd for this event, we had 115 as of this morning. There's a lot of folks who are going to want to participate in this conversation, and we could not be happier about those numbers and about creating an opportunity to maximize your engagement. So we are using the formal Q&A function at the bottom of your screens. You will see the icon that shows sort of two little text bubbles overlapping each other. That will allow you to share your thoughts and your perspectives and your questions with all of us. And we hope that we'll be able to do that to find out where the questions overlap and align so we can curate a little bit and then conduct the orchestra with our panelists towards the end of this conversation to make sure that we cover as wide an array of subject from as many of you as possible during the Q&A session following the formal remarks. So please do not wait, do not hesitate. Use that Q&A function as often and as early as you can, and we will do our best to address as many of those questions as possible. That's the main sort of, I think, thing for folks to take away from a housekeeping standpoint. And with that, let me just take a moment to formally welcome and offer my appreciation and gratitude to the three panelists who are joining Louise in this conversation. So in the order that they will be speaking, Filomena Servidio-Italiano is President and CEO of Colorectal Cancer Resource and Action Network. Dr. Winson Cheung is the Principal Director of Oncology Outcomes at the University of Calgary. And Mike Duong is the Head of Innovation at Roche Canada. You will hear from all of them in turn, starting with Filomena, and then all of them together during the Q&A period. But Louise, I think I now get to pass it back to you to see if there's anything else you'd like to say before we turn the microphone to Filomena. Okay. Louise, are we good to pass to Filomena, or is there anything else you'd like to add?
Yeah, it just takes
Wonderful.
me a minute to get all those buttons going.
Perfect.
So I just wanted to give a little bit of context to the business case, and particularly more recent context. As you may know, and thank you, Ross, for the kind comments about the business case, we launched the business case recently at the BioCanRx Summit. And then we followed it with 2 days of webinars looking more granularly at the contents of that business case. And what we heard on the webinars from the doctors who treat these patients is that oncology patients want hope. and research to make that hope reality. And innovative therapies, including precision medicine, definitely provide research and that hope. As these cancer innovations are taking place at breakneck speed, health policies need to keep up with the pace of innovation to optimize patient access to these innovative therapies. Other countries have done so, recognizing the value not only to patient care, but also to healthcare costs, capacity, and resources, and ultimately to the economy. So far, Canada has not done so, taking what I would say is a very timid few steps to recognizing the elements that are required for precision medicine. Dr. Shakil Kasim said in our webinar that there needs to be education for policymakers on how cancer management has changed. The business case was therefore developed to educate diverse stakeholders, including policymakers, on the value of precision medicine in oncology and to provide recommendations on how to achieve the changes required. We're going to talk today about 3 of these elements. And these 3 key elements will allow delivery of precision medicine while ensuring the sustainability of the healthcare system. First, we need biomarker and genomic testing, and Filomena is going to talk to us about the roles that they play. Following this, we'll learn about real-world evidence, how to define it, ways to collect it, and roles it has also in long-term analysis of precision medicine. Lastly, Michael Duong will describe a third necessary component for successful precision medicine systems to work, which are called managed entry agreements, agreements between the manufacturer and the public payers, sometimes referred to as risk sharing or pay for performance agreements. So now, Filomena, I turn it over to you for the first discussion.
Thanks very much, Louise. So allow me to bring up my slides. Can you see my slides okay, Louise?
They're great, Filomena.
Excellent. Thank
Yes,
you.
they're great.
Perfect. Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. So I'd like to thank the organizers for having invited me to participate today. I'm so very grateful. So I've been tasked to speak to the importance of and need for genomic profiling in Canada. So we all know that no 2 people are the same, so no 2 cancers are the same. So why would we treat patients' cancers identically? This is the basis upon which precision medicine was founded. While chemotherapy can be very effective and is the mainstay of cancer treatment for many patients, we know that it also comes with the potential for many side effects. So the goal of precision medicine in oncology, or precision oncology, is to provide a treatment specifically targeting the patient's unique form of cancer, based on the patient's individual genetic mutations, alterations that are fueling the cancer's growth and spread. And the hope is there will be fewer side effects incurred. The analogy that I like to use when explaining precision medicine to patients is the heat-seeking missile example. Much like heat-seeking missiles track heat sources to guide the weapon onto a target, precision medicine's targeted therapies will hone in on a specific genetic marker of the cancer, seek out the cancer in the body, preventing the cancer from dividing and growing, sparing healthy cells and limiting side effects, which we all know is highly sought after by patients. And if I can, I love to share the cartoon with patients to help solidify the concept. So we know the findings generated from biomarker testing can certainly help to inform clinical decisions and the selection of those critically important precision medicines, because it provides clinicians with the information they seek with respect to the nature and the specific features of the patient's cancer. specifically the genetic features, the molecular profile of the cancer, accounting for its growth and survival. So while many genes may indeed be tested, it's just that handful that are typically reported for which there are indications, accounting for some limitations in the management of metastatic cancer. And when it comes to accessing biomarker testing results, we at CRAN polled 11 different patient advocacy groups to try to capture their perspectives on any challenges or barriers their respective patient populations have experienced. And the top 3 reported barriers or challenges were: 1, a lack of timely access to testing and reporting of the results to help inform clinical decisions. This was, not surprisingly, the #1 reported challenge by the groups. In a perfect world, the biomarker testing results should be available by the first meeting with the medical oncologist. But this is often not the case. In-house reflex testing is truly the gold standard, but when samples need to be sent to an outside lab, there can be long and variable turnaround times to obtain those results, and medical oncologists are often the last to be involved in the patient's diagnostic journey, as patients come to oncology after seeing various other specialists for biopsies or procedures. 2, lack of patient education and awareness of biomarker testing, due in part to clinicians not discussing biomarker testing with their patients, not because they didn't want to, but because of a lack of time or a sense that the topic is too complicated to discuss with the patient, as well as a slew of other reasons we managed to capture in the post-conference manuscript that we've generated. And 3, inter- and intra-provincial disparities with respect to biomarker testing access, funding, and the silos that exist within institutions and between provinces. While Canada has what we truly know to be a universal healthcare system, it's not actually universal in the sense of providing equitable access to care, and is fragmented within and between provinces. Within jurisdictions, there are disparities often on the basis of geography, where those living in urban centers are more likely to have a biopsy done in a large academic center with in-house biomarker testing compared to those living in remote, rural areas. And furthermore, within the same province, the institutional funding and expertise to perform biomarker testing can vary between sites. So continuing on with helping to inform the selection of precision medicines, in an ideal situation, a single test would be able to provide all required biomarker testing, as opposed to testing sequential biomarkers using different techniques, which adds to that turnaround time and consumes tissue from what is frequently a limited biopsy sample. This can be achieved with a broad next-generation sequencing panel, considered to be the gold standard for biomarker testing. For most tumor types, NGS panels are able to simultaneously test for hundreds of DNA and RNA biomarkers, and are the basis for programs of comprehensive genomic profiling in Canada and around the world. CGP is an approach to assess most, if not all, clinically significant genes, which includes those relevant cancer biomarkers to inform treatment selection and to monitor therapeutic response as well. And so allow me to quickly end on why CGP is very much required for our metastatic cancer patient populations. While cancer is still classified based on the type of tissue or part of the body in which it originates, such as lung, brain, breast, colon, pancreas, and so on, we are most certainly witnessing a radical change firsthand. Researchers and clinicians are now identifying the molecular fingerprints of various cancers and using them to divide cancers' once broad categories into far more precise types and subtypes. They're also discovering The cancers that develop in totally different parts of the body can sometimes, on a molecular basis, have a great deal in common based on the molecular drivers that fuel growth and spread of cancer. Comprehensive genomic profiling, we all know, seeks to test those hundreds of genes for possible mutations through one assay. Our advanced cancer patients are exhausting standard of care therapies, and others are not responding very well to those drug therapies to begin with, which begs the question, is a more intuitive approach to the management of their advanced disease required? Therein lies the unmet need and the importance for CGP. Clinicians can choose treatments based on the DNA and RNA signature of a patient's tumor, which CGP can provide quite rapidly. If an actionable mutation or an alteration is identified through CGP, it can be exploited by accessing its precision medicine to potentially help manage the patient's cancer through a site-specific or a site-agnostic clinical trial, and yes, while not ideal, as an off-label drug therapy that patients may access for self-pay, or if fortunate enough to find, through a compassionate access program. We recognize there are some significant hurdles and challenges that we must overcome, such as cost, infrastructure, and informatics, human resources, and a lack of education on the subject matter to help us achieve implementation and early access. But coming together to assume one resounding voice will permit us to overcome them sooner as opposed to later. Our advanced cancer patients who participated in our biomarkers conference back in June spoke to an outdated method of treating metastatic cancer. Treating their cancer based on the anatomical origin of their tumor may actually be a less intuitive approach to which I previously referred, when compared to targeting the molecular mutations that drive the growth and spread of their cancer based on their experience of having accessed CGP, where an actionable mutation was identified and successfully treated. The hope is to increase collaborative efforts amongst all stakeholders to truly harness the full potential of precision oncology, which includes CGP becoming a standard of care in the management of metastatic cancer in Canada one day. Results can help to inform clinical decisions regarding treatment options, knowing there are reimbursement disparities that exist across Canada, and can certainly promote earlier participation in clinical trials in light of the low participation rates. As a community, we should strive to have every metastatic cancer patient's tumor genomically sequenced to provide patients with the best chance of survival and improved quality of life. It would be unthinkable to fail to generate a pathology report. Perhaps the same should be true of CGP. Precision medicine, the right therapy for the right patient at the right dose at the right time. Increased value to the entire healthcare ecosystem. Thank you, ladies and gentlemen. I look forward to questions and comments.
Louise, you're on mute. Oh, you're still on mute, Louise. Louise, I guarantee everything you're saying is amazing, but unfortunately, we still can't hear you.
Sorry, it
There you
keeps
go.
unmuting and muting, and thank you, Filomena, is what I was trying to say, for really a very educational and informative description of the importance of genomic profiling in precision medicine. So I want to turn to you, Winson, and I'd like to I wonder what you think. Dr. Sandy Sadev recently said that included in the challenges of obtaining and accessing precision medicine is the need to accept things including surrogate endpoints, real-world endpoints, and novel trial designs. We hear from public payers that paying for the tests that Filomena has described and precision medicine treatments are costly, and we often don't know whether they will have long-term efficacy and safety. What is real-world evidence, and how can it play a role in addressing the concerns of payers?
So I think I'll get into a lot of this in my talk that's coming up. But certainly as a data scientist and real evidence researcher, I see a major role of RWE in filling an evidence gap. Clinical trials, as you know, oftentimes enroll very specific populations of patients. They typically have very finite follow-up. So because of that, payers are uncomfortable with the uncertainty with the questions that cannot be answered by clinical trials. So I do think we have to think outside the box. I think payers and decision makers are slowly changing tunes, that they're being more open over time to these non-clinical trial data. Perhaps the pendulum is not moving as fast as we want, or at least what this group wants, but I do think it's moving. So I think it is very encouraging, and I'm optimistic that in the near future, hopefully, there'll be more acceptance of these different data sources and different evidence sources as well.
Winson, thanks so much for that. Why don't we give you a chance to actually walk through your slides and add to the conversation that's already so robustly been started by Filomena.
All right.
We can.
So thanks again for inviting me to speak today. Very excited to be here to join this esteemed panel. So I was asked today to really speak about the importance of real-world evidence in precision medicine. And the topics I was asked to cover in the next 5 to 10 minutes are as follows. I was asked to define what RWE means to me, how RWE fits into the context of precision medicine, and in particular, precision oncology, to talk very briefly at a very high level, some of the barriers of integrating RWE, and finally, to hopefully highlight some examples of how RWE has been successfully and effectively implemented into either payer or the decision-making bodies' decisions. I want to preface my talk by saying that oftentimes I do feel a bit out of place in these precision medicine presentations, because it is not uncommon for stakeholders to view precision medicine and real-world medicine to be very different and to be belonging in different ends of the spectrum. I think part of my job is to really convince you that the two are more related than one thinks. So first off, I'll define what RWE means to me. So it is a very broad umbrella term, and I'll use the nomenclature umbrella term again in a future slide. And it really has a very broad definition, and it refers to any appropriate curation or collection of data, and then advanced analytics of these data from any sources beyond conventional clinical trials. So as you can probably attest to this, it can encompass chart reviews, survey studies, qualitative studies, really the full gamut. And the reason why RWE has gained significant traction over the last few years is because there's increasing awareness of the fact that clinical trials are not the real world scenario. In the clinical trial, oftentimes a very homogeneous patient population is enrolled. So usually it's younger people, fitter individuals, and in general, there seems to be an affinity for those who live in urban areas to participate in trials because there's more access to these trials in major urban centers. In routine clinical practice, as a clinician, we see significant heterogeneity in the patients that we see. So older patients, frailer individuals, as well as those who live more remotely. So again, there's a bit of a disconnect. And the question now is, how do we apply clinical trial findings in patient populations that were generally excluded from trial participation? So because of that disconnect, there is a real evidence gap. And there's a need for payers to generate evidence, interpret evidence, in order to feel certain that the drugs they're potentially funding will actually work in the rural population. So that's one major reason why there's now significant interest in RWE. So how does RWE fit within the context of precision medicine? Precision medicine, to Filomena's point, is very exciting, very innovative, and I do think all patients should have access to these new tests. However, as I already alluded to, in general, these tests are more readily accessible and available to only a select portion of the population. In general, younger individuals, those who live in major urban centers, and in some cases, because there are some out-of-pocket costs to commute, to take time off work, it does also select and favor those who are in the higher SES or socioeconomic status group. So the question now is, well, these tests are great. They're very important. We want to use them. How do we expand their use, get it reimbursed, and also sustain its implementation for the long term? And I do think that's where RWE really fits in, because most of our projects to date are focused on looking at urban-rural differences. Who has access, who does not have access, other disparities based on geography, SES status, income level, or educational attainment. And understanding these discrepancies or disparities is really important to inform how we implement these tests in a broader, more comprehensive and population-based level. Having said all that, Louise mentioned a question or comment from one of my colleagues saying, well, how do we better integrate RWE? How do we use it more fully to inform our decisions? I think it's been a double-edged sword. 15 years ago when I started doing RWE, first of all, it wasn't called RWE. It was called Health Services Research or Health Outcomes Research. And I would spend half my time, explaining to people what I did. To industry's credit, I think the relabeling or rebranding of what I do as RWE has done wonders for my job, because people now are very excited about it. They know what it's about. So on one hand, that's been really great. I'm no longer cheerleading for what I do. But having said that, it is not uncommon now for me to go to a conference and see the term real world used in like 80% of posters that I see. Is a real world chart review, is a real world survey. And I do think the downside of that is that there's been more cloudiness in the quality of the real world studies that I'm seeing. And I think that is compromising the capacity for RWE to inform, because again, payers and stakeholders who make major decisions are really wary about the poor quality RWE. So more and more now with my trainees and my team and other collaborators, we're trying to educate and inform individuals how to distinguish good versus bad RWE. It is, RWE is an umbrella term, but it really behooves us to really distinguish what is good and what is bad. So to that point, there's been a number of initiatives in terms of tools, I would say, that equips people with the ability to grade RWE studies. So there's the GRACE checklist, there's the ISPOR questionnaire, and there's also the Robbins Eye inventory. Again, I won't have time to go through all the pros and cons of each tool, but suffice it to say, these tools are available, and I would really encourage people to adopt these tools so that over time, all the good RWE studies surface to the top and can really be leveraged fully to its full potential. And then finally, I want to touch upon some of the successes. So it's not all doom and gloom, I would say. There's been a number of examples, both in the US and also in Europe, where RWE has impacted decisions. Again, because of time, I won't have the resources or time to really go through each and every example. But really the take-home point I want to underscore to you is that it is making a difference. In some cases, RWE is being used to really document the burden of illness. What is the unmet need of a certain disease entity? And the reason why we should look at a phase 1 trial or a phase 2 trial, because a phase 3 trial is not feasible. In other scenarios, people do want a comparative study, but only a phase 2 single arm study is available. So RWE has also filled that gap by being used to generate an external control arm or a synthetic control arm to really provide that comparative effectiveness information. In most of these scenarios, I would say it is focused on more rare disease settings or rare subsets of prominent tumors. So a good example might be a rare biomarker-driven lung cancer tumor, lung cancer. So lung cancer is very prevalent, is very common, but a ROS mutated tumor or an ALK mutated tumor is very rare. So again, even in that setting, RW has a role. And just to end on a good note, I also think that when I show this slide, a common feedback I get as well, I see the FDA, I see the EMA, but what about Health Canada and CADD? What about Canada? And I would say that, again, we were probably closely following the tracks of the FDA and the EMA. There's significant interest from Health Canada and CADD in terms of incorporating RWE. And in fact, CADD earlier this year released some guidance in terms of how RWE should be done. So I do think, again, the pointer is moving, albeit not as fast as we want. So with that, I'll probably end my 10-minute sort of presentation. I do want to acknowledge my team very quickly because a lot of what I've described, that does take a team effort. And again, aligning with the idea of ending on a good note, the top right-hand corner of the slide is the new cancer center in Calgary, and it's very encouraging to see that we'll have basically 30 to 40 workspaces on the 9th floor of this building dedicated to RWE. So I do think RWE is here to stay, and I think there's huge investment in RWE. So I'm hopeful and optimistic that you'll hear more about it in the coming years. So with that, I'll pause and again, I'll hand it back over to either Ross or Louise.
Thank you very much, Winson. So I'm going to turn to you, Mike. And so what I'm hearing is that assuming we get the tests that Filomena is talking about to ensure that oncology patients receive the personalized therapy that's right for them in a timely manner, even after phase 2 trials, or with trials that are not randomized controlled trials. And if we follow the safety and efficacy outcomes long-term with real-world evidence, there's a third element to this, isn't there? And it's what is sometimes called managed entry agreements to ensure that the risks and costs are fairly shared between the stakeholders paying for these treatments and the manufacturers of them. So where does that fit in?
Mike, as you reflect on that fantastic question from Louise, I'm just going to remind this wonderful audience who's joined us today to use the Q&A icon at the bottom of your screens. If you want to share questions with us on the sort of curation side of things, we'll make sure that we maximize the robust conversation that I know you're all eager to have once Mike's presentation has wrapped up and Louise has helped to connect all the dots. So please use the Q&A function, and we're excited to have more of your questions come in as you reflect on what you're hearing. Thanks, Mike.
Yeah, no, thanks, Ross, and thanks for that question, Louise. What I'll do is I'll just in order to answer your question, I'll just jump right into my slides and build it into what I'm going to talk about. So let me just take a minute here. I'll share. Here we go. Okay, so before I start, again, just want to thank the organizers for this opportunity to discuss this topic. It's not a topic I've discussed recently because, as I tell people, I'm sort of a recovering health economist. Haven't been in health economics for a number of years now, but looking into this topic and some of the recent events around this has brought back some of those nightmares of being a health economist for me. So thanks for that opportunity. Thanks for allowing me to relive those pains and re-engage in this conversation with the community. As I dive into answering your question, Louise, I think it's important for us to understand this picture here sort of depicts how I think of access, but also how I think of this system that we're trying to build. The system that, enables patients to access the most innovative therapies and health technologies like comprehensive genomic profiling, and then the system that also makes use of real-world data to generate real-world evidence to allow us to better understand the nuances of value as it relates to our health technologies. And it brings into question the role of access, as you mentioned, and how when we think about it, if the value in real-world data and real-world evidence is to provide us with this additional level of insight around our products, and allow us to be able to get more information about these new innovations that are coming through. We actually need patients to be able to access it. I mean, it's real-world data. It's data being generated on patients that are receiving these therapies in routine clinical practice, in care provided by the various different health systems of our country. And if we do not have ways in which we can provide access to patients, we don't have a mechanism to generate real world data. And without the data, we can't generate the evidence. And we're in this vicious cycle of, well, who's going to take the first step? So I think the question for us, or maybe not the question, but the challenge for us is to think about it more as a very well-oiled, but very extremely well-integrated machine where all the cogs have to play together, and they have to be functional in order for us to be able to realize these benefits. So I've written it here, but without access, there is no real-world data. Without the data, there's no evidence. Without the evidence, there's no information. Without the information, there's no ability for us to continue to innovate and develop and bring novel therapies to market. And so that's why, we talk about managed entry agreements, because we have to figure out a way, if we want this machine to work, we have to figure out a way that we can bring these novel innovations to patients and allow them to access it. And you guys have probably seen this. The people, I was looking through the names of the participants, and I recognize quite a few of the names, and some people in the audience would know this better than I would, but for sure, most of you would recognize these various different managed entry schemes or managed entry programs that I've put out here. But what this slide tells us is that there's a number of different ways, and they're very fit for purpose, in which we can allow patients, we can enable patients to access these innovations to solve some of the challenges that we have. And this is just an example, but if depending on what you're uncertain about, depending on what you're unclear about with respect to the new product, are you uncertain about your ability to afford it as a health system, control the budget? There's different ways you can manage entry. You can have financially based schemes. You can do, and we know this, we do this within the industry all the time. But as it relates to precision medicines, what we're more sort of concerned with is the uncertainty of the overall outcome. Or maybe it's the variability. Because it's a precision medicine, there is going to be variable responses between one patient to another patient, between individuals. And so there are ways in which we can have managed entry programs and agreements that can help us through, uncovering some of these uncertainties or addressing some of these uncertainties. Coverage with evidence development is a great way in which we can generate population level evidence to remove a lot of the uncertainty of a product. In precision medicines, where we know based on your mutational driver, various different other aspects. Now we're looking at social determinants of health driving precision medicine or personalized healthcare. We know the outcomes are going to be variable, so we know we can have outcomes guarantees. We know other jurisdictions have develop patient eligibility controls, payment by results, lots of different ways that we can manage the uncertainty of providing access to patients, but not limiting the access. It's enabling access, and it's generating the data that we're asking for, the data that Winson has talked about that is so important for the system to work. This slide sort of tells us, you know, in doing a little bit of research around this topic, it's sort of the same countries that have come up, right? That, you know, I was a health economist 10 years ago. I still am technically, but I just don't do it. But it's the same countries that are doing it. It's Italy, it's England, UK, it's Spain, it's France, it's Germany, it's Sweden, it's a bunch of other European countries now with examples of it, and Canada's flag still isn't up there. And I think the question is, you know, when you look at the different types of schemes, they're very similar to the ones that I've just talked about. And they're enabling access in these countries to innovations, to precision medicines, to, you know, the latest and greatest therapies. They're also able to manage some of their uncertainties. They're also able to address it. And I didn't put Canada's flag up there because it wasn't highlighted, you know, as real agreements, as, you know, examples of what we're doing in this country. But I did want to end it again on a positive note to say, it's not that Canada's not doing anything. It's just that we haven't put in place a managed access agreement that is enabling us to do these things. I think if you look around, and this is the work that I'm now involved in as I move away from health economics and more into innovation and, you know, the health systems work of the country, it's when you look at all the different groups and all the different organizations across our country and what they're working towards, we are building a very robust health system. We are committed to building a very robust health system that can enable all of this conversation that we're having here today, this idea that we can enable access to precision medicines in oncology or in any other therapeutic area, have the infrastructure to generate very high quality data to then learn and to then remove uncertainty, then to address some of the discrepancies of outcomes. We are building the foundations of that in our health system, and there is a huge amount of commitment to that. We see work, and we've done work with CADITH, as Winson mentioned, on understanding what is high quality real world evidence. Because if you, let's be honest, if you set up a managed access agreement and you don't have a high quality, robust real world evidence repository, then, you know, you're not really getting the evidence that you need to inform the information that you require. So we've seen the commitment from the federal government in building a pan-Canadian national data system of high quality that can be used. We see commitment from CADITH to say, let's work on how we can inform what those data needs to look like so that we can inform decision making. We now need our health systems to step in and you know, fill in the box of or insert that last cog, as it were, of providing access so that we can continue to build this infrastructure. We can continue to use the data, access the data, generate the evidence, and sort of complete the machine. The machine that I'm speaking about is something that we now call the learning health system. You may have heard of that before, but the learning health system is what we are describing here in terms of using data, generating evidence, making informed decisions, and then looping all of that back into the research and development engine to create better therapies. I'm also part of another organization called the Canadian Personalized Healthcare Innovation Network, and that's an organization that is driving the collaborations that are required to drive this forward. This isn't anything that any one organization can do alone or should do individually, you know, in their own little part of the healthcare world. We all have to come together and work together on this, and that's part of what we do at CFIN, is to bring industry together with government, together with public sector organizations, hospitals, academic institutions, and we can all work on this together and build it out. I think the most important message I'll leave everybody here with is this is not a sequential thing. We should not wait for us to build the perfect data infrastructure in Canada before we have, managed entry agreements leading to the generation of data. We can do it all in tandem. We can do it all together. We have very high quality data repositories, as Winson just mentioned, for example, in Alberta with O2 and high quality expertise in that area. So all of these things are things that we can do as we're building towards, the ideal infrastructure and the ideal policies. So I'll leave it with that, and then maybe we'll move into Q&A.
Thank you very much, Michael. So it was interesting that you described the sort of cogs of the wheel. And in Canada, we have an awful lot of cogs. We start out with patients who really need timely access to badly needed medicines, certainly in oncology. We have Health Canada starting the process by determining whether the drugs that are coming into Canada are safe and effective to sell. And then we have the Patent Medicine Prices Review Board that asks the question, is the price that the manufacturer wants to sell it for in Canada excessive? To that point, we don't even have the public payers in the process. Then we move to the public payers to talk about a decision about whether to pay for the drugs from the public purse. And we use, as you mentioned, CADTH and health technology assessment bodies generally to assist the provinces in making an analysis of the evidence for value to the system. And then we have another cog in the wheel, which is the Pan-Canadian Pharmaceutical Alliance, which negotiates the prices with the public payers and with the manufacturers to determine what are the public payers willing to pay for these medicines. And that's where your managed entry agreements obviously come in. But doesn't stop there. It then moves back to each province to make its own decision about public reimbursement of a particular medication. That's a lot of cogs in a wheel. And to get them all well-oiled and, as you say, not trying necessarily to work sequentially is a challenge. So there's no doubt that the whole process is long and patients are waiting. On the other hand, payers must ensure value for the drug, or else they are paying for drugs with little value. So everyone's position is totally fair here. However, the science is making incredible strides in cancer seemingly overnight. With the use of biomarker and genomic testing, relevant real-world evidence collection and analysis, and managed entry agreements, we can get drugs to people faster and ensure equitable cost sharing. And these are all in the recommendations for the business case. And I'm just going to point out 4 of them that specifically on these topics. So we do need, as Filomena said, we need to integrate precision diagnostic tests into the process of the treatments themselves rather than siloing them and seeing them as separate. We also really need to be willing to look at phase 2 trial approvals. And this to this point has been quite a challenge. I'm not going to say it's never happened, but it seems to be quite a challenge to convince the health technology assessment folks to be willing to look at phase 2 trials. We need real world evidence. We've heard a lot about that, and it's very important. And to Michael's point, if you don't have that, then you don't really have anything. And finally, we need managed entry agreements. So then that's a win-win-win. Patients get the drugs early, we collect the data, and we determine who should be paying for what in the long term through managed entry agreements. So that's kind of the algorithm, if you like, that I like to think about it as. So I guess it's now over to you, Ross, to see if we've got any questions from our audience.
Yeah, thanks so much, Louise, and thank you, Mike and Filomena and Winson, for complementary but connected presentations, which feels very apropos given the subject and the sort of hosting organizations. So just another encouragement for folks to drop your questions into the Q&A. There's some that have come in, and I'm excited to bring them to this group. I should also flag to everyone that this webinar, as sort of posted with video and slides, will be put on YouTube. So we'll send that link around as part of our follow-up. We'll also be creating an audio-only version in podcast format. So there will be opportunities for folks to listen and watch and reflect again going forward, and there'll be information on all of that we will share with you following the official conclusion at 2 o'clock. So stay tuned for a follow-up from us and links to those different platform availability. Just maybe I'll start with a question about kind of data and infrastructure. A number of you have talked about, sort of this disconnect between what we wish we had access to and what we ideally actually have access to now. And I wonder if, Winson, maybe I can start with you a little bit. What do you see as sort of the biggest challenges around sort of insufficiency of data or non-integration of data or non-interoperability of data? What are sort of some of the biggest challenges that you reflect on in terms of not having more of what you wish you had to allow you to do the analysis that underpins so much of what you talked about?
I can probably go on about the pain points, but I think there are some major ones. I think one is, when I give similar talks in Europe or other countries, I guess, there's this sort of assumption that Canada is one big country and all the data systems are all linked and harmonized, when in fact there's really like a dozen different data systems. So even though we really desire pan-Canadian data, it's been really tricky to pool data, merge data, or federate data across provincial borders. I know there's been some ongoing initiatives to really make that happen, but the time horizon on that sort of initiative, is long. Probably a number of years before we'll see it, fully to fruition. So that's been really tricky. For rare tumors, for example, it's very difficult to just use data from one province or one jurisdiction. So I think that's been challenging. So that's a data collection part. I think analytics would also be another sort of issue. I think gone are the days that we can kind of work off the side of our desk and have an Excel spreadsheet open and do a quick analysis and publish it. I think it does require expertise and training to really translate data into evidence. And I get a little concerned when an untrained person is now meddling with data, because that's how bad RWE results, and that really clouds the picture. One bad RWE in a bucket of good RWE, that is adequate to deter a decision maker from adopting RWE. So the anecdote I give is that I would never dabble in phase 1 trials because I'm not trained to do that, and I would make a case for that if you haven't been trained in RWE, probably to kind of look for collaborators who are well trained and well experienced. Because I think we want to ensure that everything we produce is decision grade. So I think those, I would say, were the two big ones.
Thanks so much for that, Winson. Louise or Filomena or Mike, do you guys want to jump in on this infrastructure question, or should we keep going?
If I may, Ross.
Please.
Mike made such a really, really good point. We cannot generate real-world evidence, real-world data, unless patients get access to those innovative technologies. We just can't. And one of the points that I really wanted to bring up as the head of a patient advocacy group is we are tasked with seeing to it that we make very thoughtful, very compelling patient evidence submissions. And seeing that a number of the clinical trials are essentially generated long before we are tasked with making those patient evidence submissions, gaining access to patients who have that really important experience to essentially tap into those values, those priorities, those preferences when it comes to the therapeutic under review. It truly must be one of the greatest challenges a patient advocacy group has. because in Canada, at least, and it likely works the same way around the world, we just cannot gain access to those patients. They're just not there. They don't necessarily have that experience. That real world evidence is just not available to us. And so it was a really, really good point that Mike made. Thanks, Mike.
Thank you. Maybe I'll add a little bit of something as well. I agree with what Winson said with respect to, you know, the big barriers, the big challenges that we're facing within this system of ours. I think another thing for us to think about, and this, you know, was just recently brought to my attention this year at a previous conference, was when we're talking about data and the infrastructure as part of the health system, it actually hasn't been fully incorporated as part of our health system. So hear me out. A hospital planning committee, especially in Ontario, for example, you know, if you are the chief planning officer of a hospital and you make a pitch to the government, the provincial government for funding for your hospital, and you throw in there, and now this is different in BC and different in Quebec, but in Ontario, if you throw in there that a piece of that funding is meant to build digital infrastructure for data scientists, those you know, seats that Winson you have in your new facility in Ontario, if you made a pitch for the budget to go towards that, that does not get approved because they don't believe that the digital infrastructure should be paid for by the healthcare budget. And then the hospitals are required to go into their community, required to go to the foundations, the hospital foundations, the charities, the lotteries. All of this community funding has to be, you know, raised in order for them to pay for digital infrastructure. So if we are to build data expertise, if we are to build facilities and capabilities in data analysis and, you know, digital processing and all of these things that are so important to the future of healthcare, we have to bring it into the health system. We have to recognize that this is a value worth investing in, and those healthcare budgets have to go towards this type of infrastructure. Now I know there is work in Ontario, and we're working with BC, and we're working with our Quebec colleagues to try to increase our ability to do that, but it's still very, very far behind.
I guess I would like to say that one of the issues that I think is very important is the education of the public, of patients, of the importance of data and the collection of their data. I think there is really not a very clear understanding generally about the importance of these data. And I think that's unfortunate because then, to your point, well, to everybody's point, really, you don't have the kind of pressure on the system to make these things part of the system. And of course, a part of that is a fear about what's going to be done with their data. Is it going to be kept confidential? Is it going to be used inappropriately? But that's, you know, that's really very easily managed, I think, within our systems if we want to do that. So I'd really, you know, love to see more education of the public about why this is so important and why they should be asking their politicians and their bureaucrats in the health systems to integrate this into the health system, as you mentioned, Mike.
Winson, I don't know if you want to pick up on this question, but as Mike talks about sort of the importance of embedding some of these receptors and kind of analytical power into hospitals, you know, you showed a beautiful picture of a new hospital with a whole bunch of folks and a whole bunch of offices. Any reflections or insights on how you were able to make a successful case for why this is so important to integrate into a new cutting edge center in Calgary?
I mean, it was a lot of work. It didn't come very easy, unfortunately. I mean, to my leaders' credit, I think they did listen and they listened and also saw the value and anticipate that RW will play a larger and larger role in the coming years. So a bit of it sort of, you know, perhaps my team's track record, but a bit of it is also this faith that they have that, you know, in the coming years, we want to be a pioneer and be a champion of what's needed. So I think they saw that and there was alignment in that vision. So, you know, kudos to them for seeing that. To Louise's point, I do think it can be an uphill battle funding for RWE studies is way lower than clinical trials, and I would want to see more investment in data sciences and the data infrastructure as well. And funding again usually comes, it's sort of type of a project. Getting funding for infrastructure is very, very difficult. So again, I don't have the answer for you except to say that hopefully more advocacy, being more vocal about it will go a long way. So I look to the audience and the panel here to really advocate for this kind of work, not just for my team, but for all other teams as well.
It's interesting. I think sometimes in Canada, we see a situation where health systems don't necessarily want to be first, but they also don't really want to be last. So the more kind of early movers we can point to and show, profile those as examples to learn from and folks not to get too far behind, the easier maybe the advocacy lift will be to build that infrastructure and that capacity. Interesting question that just came out around, speaking of capacity, about sort of the human resources capacity for engaging and sort of animating and succeeding in this RWE space. There's a lot of interest among industry folks. There's a lot of interest among policymakers, around academics and clinicians. How do we train, attract, grow, support sort of a new generation of Canadians who are comfortable with these concepts and comfortable at the interplay of all of the parts of the health system that we're talking about here? How do we find ways to expand the actual human capacity that will allow this work to be done the way we're all so excited about it being done? Do you guys have thoughts on that?
Maybe I'll
Mike.
start to think about this, because it's tied to some work I was doing a few years ago in sort of bringing together the Ministry of Health Canada, and the Ministry of Science and Economic Development. So, this notion that healthcare is a cost in Canada and it's an expense. We shouldn't think of it that way. We should think of it as obviously an investment. And probably the greatest investment we can make in the country. It's an investment into the health of our peoples, but it's also an investment that could drive economic growth at levels unparalleled by any other industry. When you think about the massive, Winson knows this better than I do, but the massive amount of health data that's being generated on a daily basis, and you think about the ability to then apply trained, highly skilled professionals into this field of data analysis, data research, artificial intelligence, we can create an entirely new industry here that could have trillions of dollars of value. We just have to be, I don't want to say less precious about our personal health information, because it's extremely important to be precious about that. But we have to understand how to use it, how to leverage it. We have to understand what it can do for us if we are able to, access health data and use it for good. And that power is incredible. That power is the ability to save lives, but it's also the ability to grow our economy, at scales unimaginable.
Louise, I want to throw to you, because I've heard you many times sort of speak eloquently about maybe a disconnect between where patients often themselves feel, or what patients themselves feel about their data, and what sort of system decision makers and privacy kind of advocates sometimes assume that patients feel about their data. Do you want to jump in on this piece? Because I think you've been thoughtful about it before.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, I hear so much from bureaucrats and politicians about what patients think about things, and I always wonder, which patients did they talk to? I have never spoken to a patient in all the years that I've been working in this area who said, I don't want you to use my data for research. I don't want you to use my data to improve both my life and the lives of other people. And so when I hear those things, I don't find credibility in them. And I'm not sure, where they get this impression, but patients are more than willing to provide their data as long as it's well protected. We want to provide it. We want research to move ahead. We want real world evidence to move ahead. We want all of that. So yeah, I don't know where the disconnect really is between what policymakers think and what we think as patients, but it does seem to be there, and that's very unfortunate.
Winson, I'll go to you with the digital hand. Thank you. And then Filomena, I know you're going to want to jump on this too. So Winson, and then to you, Filomena.
Yeah, just two quick remarks. I really want to echo what Louise just said, because at O2, over the last few years, we've also formed a patient and family advisory council, because we really value the patient perspective in all of our research and projects. And they too have the same sentiment. They just assume that we're already leveraging their data. They want the data to be used fully to help others. But so when I share with them that sometimes it is a struggle to get data and access to data, they're really unsure where that's coming from, and they really want to kind of vocalize and articulate their support for the use of data. So the more we can kind of talk about this, the better, I think. And then I want to look back really quickly to the capacity building part.
Please.
We are training trainees to focus and pursue RW as a career, but again, there's not always funding to support these trainees, because funding is for projects, not trainees or human resources per se. So I would say one or two trainees are produced from our team every year. But I kind of harp back on one of my own experiences where I graduated medical school 20 years ago, and upon graduation, the government said, "Oh, we miscalculated. We need more physicians." So they doubled enrollment the next year, but you don't see the fruit of the labor for 10 years because of all the training. So I would say, stay patient. In 5-10 years, you will see probably more people sort of, of my breed in other centers, and hopefully that will increase the capacity for more projects.
Winson, thanks for that. And this question of sort of building the human potential to capture the digital data and RWE potential, that this feels like something that a number of conversations with across the ecosystem, including with the system itself, need to happen. So we'll kind of put a pin in that and maybe come back to it. Filomena, and I know you have thoughts on everything you've heard.
That's precisely what I was going to say. I typically approach issues such as this that involve real world evidence, real world data, from an educational point of view, because education has a tendency to elucidate. And so when it comes to something like this that requires what I believe to be a short-term investment, it has a tendency to be offset by long-term benefits that are experienced across the healthcare system. And it has a tendency to provide so many benefits in the long term. And I echo what Louise just said. Our patients are constantly telling us, use my experience, use my journey, use my data, because it can potentially benefit so many others who will come after me. And they say this with one resounding voice. And so we're very much supportive of potentially putting in dollars up front to eventually reap tremendous benefits later on.
Thank you guys for all that. Maybe a question about sort of the global perspective and landscape. I mean, RWE is not this conversation you are all having about capturing these opportunities and the promise and potential of precision medicine. This is a global conversation that I know you are all involved with through many different channels and around many different tables. We are seen through one lens a bit up the track. And I think, one of the nice things about being maybe later to the party is you get to see everything that's happened before you arrived and take the best insights and learnings from folks who may have gone earlier. And I wonder if you guys would like to reflect a little bit on sort of what you've seen in some other jurisdictions that are relevant for the Canadian experience that might help us accelerate our progression or our journey. And what's the best way to know what to absorb and embed or adopt from other places versus what we have to build here from scratch, if you will. Any thoughts on the global landscape and implications for Canada? I know you guys have thoughts.
Yeah, I'm happy to jump, but I saw Winson unmute as well. Do you want to go first?
Go ahead, Mike. I can follow you once you make your comment.
Okay. I think there's, I mean, Ross, to your point, like we're a little bit late to the game, but late isn't always a bad thing with respect to this area. I think one of the things that you can see in those examples that I shared with respect to managed entry agreements, so we do know there's a number of countries that have, at least for, you know, like England, for example, for the last, gosh, like 10, 15 years have been using managed entry agreements. Italy, same thing. The technology probably wasn't on their side, you know, as it relates to the collection of data, the ability to analyze data. And so we see a lot of that infrastructure being built by certain groups. And with respect to Italy, for example, it's built by the industry. The pharmaceutical companies have to pay for the registries, the creation. I mean, it's a shared cost amongst all industry members, but they have to build the disease registries to collect the data. And those data are being collected manually by data analysts and data entry clerks. And so that was a side effect of, you know, the technology wasn't yet there, but they wanted to do it, and so they built it. I think this is where and obviously the cost of doing that, the cost is factored into the cost of the healthcare business, and so there's some ramifications there. I think going forward now, you know, it's been 10, 15, almost 20 years since some of those registries have been built. The technology has advanced incredibly in that time period. We can do things now very efficiently, very sustainably. The technology is there for us to, you know, have access to real-time data, and it enables us to have fully interoperable data between one site to another site with very little human intervention. So it can be done for a very low cost, if we allow it to be done for a very low cost, and that's a big if, right? And so there are a lot of policies and governance rules and maybe some legislation, but you could argue a lot of it isn't law. Most of it is policies and business rule that restrict us from being able to do this. But if we look at modernizing some of those policies, we actually can leverage the technology and build this infrastructure for a fraction of the cost that it would have cost 20 years ago. So I would encourage anybody on the line who has influence in the policy space to really look at the policies that govern access to data and the use of technology within the data infrastructure to say, like, can we rethink some of these policies and allow technology to come in and save us?
Thanks, Mike. Winson.
I was also going to add that, like, you know, there has been a lot of work and progress in other countries and in the global landscape. You know, lots been done. And I think we are maybe a bit late, but having said that, in scenarios or projects where we have been able to contribute Canadian data, whether it's from Alberta or another province, the global partners have been very impressed with the data that we do have. And with the right teams involved, also with the analytics and what we produce. So I do think, you know, if we're using the term, you know, quote unquote late, I think our catch up will be pretty swift once all this infrastructure and sort of, you know, regulations are sort of sorted out a little bit. So I do think the potential is really high for Canada to really step up and be a leader. You know, in more recent years, you know, our group has also done a lot of work with patient access programs and patient support program data. So these are programs where, you know, to bridge the gap between, a positive recommendation and reimbursement. These programs provide, I would say, complementary drugs to patients for, a short interval. And that's also a source of data that we've been leveraging, and other countries have kind of taken notice to what we're doing. So again, there are certain aspects that I think we are perhaps not as late to the game. But again, the potential is really high once a lot of the details and logistics are sorted out.
That is an incredibly sort of optimistic and an important message to sort of leave towards the end of this conversation, Winson. So thank you for putting it so succinctly. Question for Filomena and Louise, and then maybe Louise, after this one, we'll sort of pass it back to you to bring this fantastic conversation to a close. the role of patient organizations in this broad conversation about data, collecting data, managing data, educating about data, supervising or leading registries of data. Talk a little bit about sort of how you would like that evolution of that role, and what would be your sort of dream future when it comes to amping up the role of patient organizations in this whole conversation.
Oh. Yeah. Louise, would you like to go first?
Not at all.
You're going to say that. It's this is such a great question, because what we've been doing at CRAN is we hosted our very first biomarkers conference back in June, where we have been exploring the issue of biomarker testing, the reporting of timely results, ctDNA, testing, and genomic profiling, which we've taken a great interest in, as well as trying to deliver all of these issues by adopting a value-based healthcare lens. And data has come up, and we're actually real-world data, real-world evidence. And what we're trying to do is we're trying to explore this more and more at our second conference coming up in June of 2024. And what we've tried to do is we've tried to collaborate with as many patient advocacy groups as possible, so that we do have one resounding, cohesive voice that we can deliver when approaching public policymakers, because education is key when it comes to these particular issues. So we are approaching our patient advocacy heads again to determine whether or not we can officially establish a position on this very issue. So this question is timely. Do we have an official position as of yet? No, because we would like to poll our patient advocacy group heads and then establish an official position. Louise will obviously be one, as well as the balance of the patient advocacy group heads whom we are approaching. So I haven't really answered the question officially, but we will. So stay tuned, my friends.
Awesome. Thanks, Filomena. Louise.
Well, I mean, I think, first of all, patients trust patient organizations. They don't always trust all the other stakeholders in the ecosystem quite as much. And so we really are a very good conduit for knowledge translation to patients about, and to the public, about what these things mean in reality, not just in theory, but in practice. What does all of this mean in practice to you? And I think that that is a very important role for us. And also the role of gathering data from patients and rolling it up and analyzing it and helping decision makers understand it. One of the things that I've, speaking to Filomena's point about value-based healthcare, one of the tenets of value-based healthcare is to look at patient-reported outcome measures. It's not what other people think we want as outcomes for our health that matters. It's what we think we want. It's what we want that is important. And that is a problem that we have not solved. It seems like everybody else knows what we want except us, apparently. And the other thing that I find really distressing is the silo budgeting in our health system. Rather than, these little pie charts with this much will go for drugs, and this much will go for hospitals, and this much will go for doctors, and usually a very large part will go for administration. Why are we not bundling services? That's also part of value-based healthcare. And it's exactly what we've been talking about here today. If, in fact, doing the testing that Filomena is talking about and doing the real-world evidence analysis that Winson is talking about and developing managed entry agreements, as Michael's been talking about, if those actually save money for the healthcare system overall, because you bundle the services that the population, each population needs. Some populations may need more drugs, some may need more hospital care, but whatever it is, you bundle those. And then you put a price on those rather than saying, well, we've run out of money in the drug budget this year, so too bad. Or, you know, we don't have any room in the hospitals anymore because, you know, we've used up our budget, too bad. I think it's absolutely wrong-headed, and we should be actually turning that whole notion on its head.
A lot of vigorous nods from those of us on the camera as you were talking about that, Louise. So thanks for leaving us with that point. Louise, I'm gonna bring the mic back to you in one sec just to formally wrap this up, but I'll just take one moment very quickly to thank all of you who joined this meaty, thoughtful, complimentary conversation and for the very interesting questions that you shared with all of us. And thank you, Winson and Michael and Filomena and Louise, for having so much to say on this and so many other issues, and for blending your perspectives and your insights in such a helpful and timely way. This is not the last time we will have a version of this conversation. We hope that all of you will come back and do it again with us. And thanks on behalf of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition and Louise CONECTed for being a part of today. And to you, Louise, to take us home.
Thank you. Yeah, I certainly want to thank everyone who joined us today for what I hope was at least educational, thought-provoking, and of course, my hope would be also action-provoking webinar. We really have to move along with this. We can't just keep talking about it. And of course, I want to thank the panelists for their presentations today. I think it's always wonderful when I see multi-stakeholders working together, because that's really what we need. We need everybody in this conversation. Everybody has something to share and to provide. So I think that's amazing. And I'd like to see more, of the government folks joining us in these conversations as well. And I also, of course, want to thank Santa's Health, who presented this on behalf of the Resilient Healthcare Coalition, and for Ross for moderating this for us. And most of all, I want to thank my colleagues at CONECTed and at Save Your Skin Foundation, and the organizations, and CCRAN, of course, and the other organizations that support the work that we do. So I would just wish you all a very good holiday season. Rest up, because there's going to be lots to do next year.
Perfect note, Louise. Thank you all, and we'll see you all again in 2024.